I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Brookings Doha Center event entitled America Decides, Implications of the U.S. Elections. My name is Samer Shahata. I'm a professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome our two guests this evening. To my left immediately is Dr. Joshua Mitchell, and then to his left is Dr. Khalid Haroub, both distinguished academics. Dr. Mitchell is a professor of political theory at Georgetown University, as well as Georgetown, Qatar. He has been chairman of the government department at Georgetown and also associate dean of faculty affairs here at SFSQ. Between 2008 and 2010, Dr. Mitchell was the acting chancellor of the American University of Iraq. He has multiple publications, books and articles, including Not by Reason Alone, Religion, History, and Identity in Early Modern Thought, The Fragility of Freedom, Tocqueville on Religion, Democracy, and the American Future, Plato's Fable, on the mortal condition in shadowy times, and his most recent book entitled Tocqueville in Arabia, Dilemmas in a Democratic Age. His work lies at the intersection between political thought and theology in the West. On his left is Dr. Khalid Haroub, who's a professor at Northwestern University here in Qatar. And his focus is on Middle Eastern studies and politics, with a particular interest in Islamism and Arab media studies. Dr. Haroub is also a senior research fellow at the Center for Islamic Studies at Cambridge University. He also is a prolific author, having written a book entitled Hamas, Political Thought and Practice, another one on Hamas, as well as several edited volumes, including Political Islam, Context versus Ideology, as well as Religious Broadcasting in the Middle East. Okay, we have a very interesting topic to discuss this evening, which is the outcome of the recent election. And the way we will proceed is each panelist will have about 5 to 8 minutes or so for opening remarks. And then after that, we will have a discussion and so on. And then at the end of that discussion, I will open up the session for questions from the floor. And so without any further delay, I'll ask Professor Mitchell to begin.
Thank you, Samer. I know many were surprised by the election, and I will say that I have not been. As early as July 15th, or July of last year, I was telling my colleagues who refused to believe me that we are in the midst of a populist uprising in America, that we're having an Andrew Jackson moment, that as much as you might want to spin it as simply a race issue, I think it's more complicated than that, probably best understood as a cities-rural conflict. And of course, as you move toward globalization, it's the cities that benefit and not the rural areas. So I think this is a large part of what has happened. So populism explains part of what's going on. Trump was able to captivate the audience that was concerned with that, and I'll explain Trump's ideas very briefly in a few minutes. But the other thing that you have to understand is that the Republican Party is not a one, it's a many, and it has been a many for a very long time. In the 1950s, you had Buckley giving us cultural conservatism. You have the economic liberals, as they're called, which turned to Hayek. In the 1980s, Reagan brought on the evangelicals. And then, in addition, you had Roman Catholics who were deeply concerned with Vatican II. And so, because I do history of political thought, let me just give you the authors, right? So you had Edmund Burke, Friedrich Hayek, John Calvin, Aquinas and Aristotle. And for those of you who know these authors, these people do not cohere. They have nothing to say to one another. And so my argument has been that the Republican Party was held together less by internal cohesion than by what it opposed during the Cold War. And so that began to fall apart after 1989. And so it was only a question of time before someone like Trump came along. My view is the Democratic Party is in similar disarray right now, and I see that as a fortunate thing because there are all sorts of questions about the organizing principle, and that's what I want to talk about now. So in a September article in Politico, I made the point that, that we've actually been engaged in a fantastic experiment in global order since 1989. And my argument has been that the fundamental organizing principle has been twofold. It's been globalization and identity politics. And anybody who teaches in a university knows that's all we give to our students. Now, it's a fantastic experiment because the alternative is the state. And what we've done instead is we've said instead of the sovereign state and sovereign citizens, we've suggested we go super-state globalization and sub-sovereign citizen identity. This has been the experiment of the last 20 years, and my view is it cannot hold together. It's profoundly unstable. Anybody who teaches and reads Thomas Hobbes in 1651, who wrote the Leviathan, knows that this cannot work. And so the uprisings around the world, in my view, are attempts, oftentimes brittle and ill-formed, to oppose this globalization and identity politics. So let me just name, therefore, the 6 ideas that, and note my word, lurk or hover over Donald Trump. I don't say that he has all of these all the time, but it strikes me that the movement that he's forming actually has these 6, and they are internally coherent. Borders matter. Immigration policy matters. National interests, not so-called universal human interests, matter. Entrepreneurship matters. Decentralization matters. And PC speech, without which identity politics is inconceivable, must be repudiated. This is what's going on right now around the world. It will be ill-formed. It is still ill-formed. But what we're arguing about, I believe, is not Trump, not any of the other manifestations of nationalism. We're arguing about the ideas that they are conveying. And I think as citizens around the globe, we have to ask the question, has this experiment in globalization and identity politics failed? My own view is that it absolutely has failed. I could say more about U.S. foreign policy, but it seems to, as a consequence of the Trump presidency, because I think there are distinct implications of that. But I think what I will do now is stop, and we can have a conversation about this in due course.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samer. Well, I have, ironically speaking, 6 points as well. Not necessarily from within the American political system, but more so from without, from outside, with more focus on the foreign policy and kind of the ramification of the outcome of these elections on the Middle East. So and even the points that I'm going to mention at the beginning, 3 of them, they do seem as more Americanized from within, yet they have implications, long-term implications on the Middle East. One is Trumpism, as I call it. Trumpism is, it is not to do with the Trump as individual, as a personality, as nowadays a president, but in fact to do more with the phenomenon, with the current that has been surfaced as a result of these elections. And it's very worrying and very dangerous. It means that is behind the winning of Trump, you have very solid constituency that believes in the ideas, in the ideals, in the racism maybe, in this very radical discourse that Trump has been not shying away from even saying this publicly over and over again. So when it comes to the elements of this Trumpist discourse, we can see all the ugliest maybe manifestations of political incorrectness. You can damn and you can name peoples, cultures, religions in a very negative way without shying away. This is new. And another part of this Trumpism is to bring in to the mainstream, to streamline all these previously maybe negative or shying again or neglected, ignored elements of the discourse. So you may have, of course, racism here and there in every single society, but most of the time, all of the time, they would live on the margin, but not in the mainstream discourse. So I think the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous outcomes in these elections is to shift, to move all these marginalized, ignored discourses to the mainstream. So nowadays it's kind of predictable, it's okay for not only the layman in the street, but also the president of the most powerful state to pronounce very racist declarations against X or Y culture or religion. So I think this is one thing. And then giving the legitimization of this process. This is kind of part of the campaign of anti-political correctness. That is, you have to speak up, just to speak up. All these kind of hidden sentiments and raw statements and feelings, you can express them publicly without having or feeling any guilt. So this kind of shift from the margins to the mainstream, to the heart of politics, going through not only from the man in the street all the way up to the Congress because of the JASTA law, this is one manifestation, and now to the president himself. And so we could expect some oblique, in fact, politics in the very near future. Now you have the whole system, the whole political structure is controlled and dominated by Republicans, the president, the Congress, the Senate, this and that. Now, my second, and of course, one big target of this Trumpism is the Arabs, the Muslims, the Latinos, all the others. So you have anti, then you can just add on, fill in the blank, whatever you like. The second point is to do with the American democracy. American democracy has been for many, many years, as this is the shining model for so many people. Now you have, with the very long process, very long months, and having all these kind of, it has been said this is maybe the dirtiest and the most ugly, maybe absurd election campaign in the American history. Now with this, you have the faith in democracy, the faith in the idea of democracy have been somehow depleted, somehow kind of eroded. If this is the democracy that you are promoting, you liberals, including myself, we don't simply need it. We don't want it. This is really very absurd. So even the idea, and this of course is reflected and affecting all the discourses, all the debates within the Middle East and elsewhere. The so many democratic models that we still have in the Middle East, as fragile and as weak as they are affected by this democratic performance in America. Now, two more points on maybe kind of relating more to the foreign policy. The first one is, because this is very important for many people in the region, to do with Palestine. For Palestine, the central issue in the region, again, for so many people, despite the so many wars and conflicts, still you have the bedrock of so many wars. In my maybe belief and others, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unless you resolve this, you will have the environment, the land will stay fertile for so many difficulties. Now, when we think of what kind of approach that Clinton or even Trump have adopted towards Palestine, we have either similarity or a race regarding or towards who's showing more support to Israel. Again, more frustration within the region. So if you have the two main candidates kind of racing not only to win the seat of power in America, but also to show more support to Israel, this consequently kind of leads to further and further frustration in the region. Two more points, then I stop. One is to do with international foreign policy and regional foreign policy. This is not kind of a prediction, but a way of open the discussion. When it comes to the American foreign policy internationally, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but a key test that we have to keep kind of observing is the position and Trump's position and the American foreign policy towards Russia. I think Russia would determine, and the policy towards Russia would determine so many other issues globally when it comes to how Trump and the new administration would behave globally. You have the rise of Russia nowadays with this thirst for global influence, regional and even European and elsewhere, desire to have leverage, and at the same time you have the withdrawal, the American withdrawal from so many other regions. So you have two movements going in two different directions. Now, what would be Trump's position? Now, we all know that we have very maybe short honeymoon between Trump and Putin, Putin being the first president to congratulate Trump, but in my view, this is very kind of short honeymoon. So this is something that we need to observe, because I guess it would determine so many other issues globally. In the region, regionally in the Middle East, more specifically, and then this is my last point, the parallel to Russia is Iran. So what would determine the American foreign policy in the region is whether Trump is following the same policy of Obama, or if he changing gears radically. And he said it on the record so many times that he will dismantle the nuclear deal with Iran. This is really very big. So nobody knows whether he will fulfill this promise or not. If he goes down this road, this means we will kind of be seeing and witnessing restructuring maybe of so many, of the landscape, the political landscape in the Middle East, and this will require him to change even so many other promises of not intervening. So he is seen as isolationist, not kind of intervening in different regions of the world. If he decided to dismantle the deal with Iran, this means, well, he may need to change even this isolationist approach. And because we are still at the heart of the storm, prediction is something very, very difficult maybe, and even unadvisable, and I stop by this.
Thank you very much. There is, of course, so much to talk about, both in terms of foreign policy, of course, and how a Trump presidency will affect this region and internationally. But there's also, I think, being American, so much still to think about in terms of what happened in the United States. And I have to say, in terms of domestic politics and so on, and I have to say, the victory, I think, was unthinkable for many Americans. Maybe the 49 million who didn't vote for Donald Trump. And my question then is, how did everyone get this wrong? Right? I mean, if you looked at the polling data in the United States for the last 3 months and so on, whether it was Nate Silver or the New York Times and so on, or everyone else, with few exceptions, everyone predicted a Clinton victory. Clinton had much more money in terms of this campaign, and we all know how important money is in terms of American politics. It was said that Clinton and the Democrats had a wonderful ground game. That is, they had mobilization and people on the ground, and Donald Trump didn't, and so on. Of course, Hillary had her own scandals, but she didn't seem to make the kind of weekly mistakes and gaffes that Donald Trump made every week, it seemed, and so on. And lastly, Clinton had the support of not everyone in the Democratic Party, but almost the entire party, including Bernie Sanders, whereas Donald Trump had exactly the opposite. Many mainstream Republicans, whether it was foreign policy people like Paul Wolfowitz or the Bushes or Condoleezza Rice and so on, or Colin Powell, said that they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. So my question to you, Joshua, is, how did everyone get this so wrong?
Well, let me say two things about that. When Obama came into office, the slogan was change. And then in 2010, 2012, you had the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement, different sides of the political spectrum. They too wanted change. Since when do you, on the basis of that 6 or 8 year move, why was that going to change now? The American people wanted change. And that's what they got. That's the first thing I will say. The second thing I will say is I've operated under what I call the six-point rule for quite some time now. The media and the elites have so shamed the American people into believing that you are morally reprobate if you would even believe in this candidate. My view was everybody simply said, I'm not telling you. They didn't even tell them at the exit polls. And I think this is a huge surprise because, to come down to the language of identity politics, we have been told in America that the only language you can speak in terms of is identity politics and race. And so to be opposed to Hillary or to be opposed to Obama means you must be a racist. I live 100 miles away from Washington. I have a carpentry crew on my house, 2 white guys and an American Indian. I take my tools down to Eastern Shore Services to get them serviced. 3 white guys and a black guy. They're all poor. They're all struggling. They hear elites telling them they must be racist because they haven't gotten a piece of the pie, the globalization, and they're angry. This is what happened. And if the Americans keep, the Hillary Clinton people keep calling these people racists, they don't understand what's happening. This proves why they lost. Identity politics is over. That's what this election is about. In my view, and I didn't say this earlier, but my view is we have now a huge question in front of us. Because if identity politics and globalization is over, and we're going to have the reemergence of the state, which is my view of what should happen and what is happening, the only question for me is whether it's going to be an illiberal state or a liberal state, a xenophobic state, or one that respects the rights of citizens. And here I'm deeply sympathetic to your concerns. With respect to Trump, if I may go on for one more minute.
Of course.
It seems to me that, let me step back, in 2008, Obama won the election because of a Facebook strategy. And the Republicans had no idea what hit them. Well, I have news for you. Trump won the election with a Twitter strategy. Okay? Didn't have a ground game, he had a Twitter game. Well, the problem with Twitter is that it invites acerbic and inflammatory comments. That's what it does. And anyone who has traveled in New York and meets people from Queens knows that Donald Trump characters are all around you. They're irascible, they're mean-spirited, but what you have to understand is he's not a fascist, he's a guy from Queens. Okay? And what that means here is that, and it's all you had to do is read his book, The Art of the Deal. What's the first?
Did he write the book, though?
No, he didn't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it's now mythos. I'm not even saying that it's his book. It's the mythos of Trump, which he adopts, and the book got it right whether he wrote it or not. What's the art of the deal? The first thing you do is you say the most inflammatory possible thing you can, A, to get attention, B, to set the standard for the debate, and then you back down. So, no, there will not be a wall. No, he's not going to go after Muslim Americans. I mean, are there problems here? Yes, of course. Racism is a huge problem in America. I make no mistake about it. And let me be clear, I'm not apologizing for Donald Trump. What I'm trying to describe is the way in which he thinks. So the first part of the deal is he says these inflammatory statements, but you have to understand something about this kind of character. Politics is rhetoric for him. Governance is policy. These are entirely different matters. And he was brilliant, and he said this, the only way I could get rid of my 16 opponents was to be as inflammatory as you possibly can. If you saw his acceptance speech, his victory speech this morning, this was not the Donald Trump that you had heard about. So look, I don't want to say everything's going to be rosy because I don't believe everything's going to be rosy. What I do believe, though, is this identity politics globalization is under threat all around the globe, and I welcome it. My concern, and it's largely a concern for Europe, less a concern for America, is whether we're going to have an illiberal state in Europe, because I think in Europe that is the problem. Why? Because nations are based on identities, if you will, bloodlines, types. But the American project, and Tocqueville saw this in the great book Democracy in America, America's committed to an idea of liberty. And in principle, all people can participate in that. So it's not a xenophobic operation. I'm very worried about illiberal states developing in Europe. That's my concern.
So if I can ask a follow-up question to Khalid that recognizes this but takes it in a slightly different identity form, and one that has been talked about, which is the question of gender, or the fact that Hillary Clinton is the first female presidential candidate and so on. Did that have anything to do with her loss, do you think? Another way of asking the question,
I'm not sure, because most of, let's say, the utopian or the idealistic expectation that being on the female side, this should have played in her favor. But I guess because she has been well established in the establishment, she is a member, she is kind of the representative of this portrayed as corrupt, kind of decaying establishment. And I think Trump has been really greatly successful in this. So the fact of the gender kind of fact of her, I think, has been somehow downplayed. And then he just kind of put under light the fact this is the most important thing. And she has been there for 20 years, 25 years, and this is the experience. And I think at one point, he said, well, I lack experience, you have the experience, 20 or 25 years of experience of failure. So I am happy without this experience. So again, focusing on that kind of thing, and he was successful. But I mean, just briefly on the point of expecting or not expecting Trump coming this far. I was maybe one of the few who expected this, and I said on the record over the past 3-4 weeks, Trump is coming. And why is this? Because despite the fantastic polling system in America, scientifically, statistically designed in the best way maybe you can think of, still though, from my humble experience maybe in the region, in the Middle East, you have a slight kind of proportion, a percentage of people, maybe 5 to 10%, depending on the case, that they wouldn't say what they really think of, because especially if the candidate that they are supporting or the party or the group is perceived by the public as this is the extreme or the extremist group. So they would rather abstain or not saying or shying away or saying, well, I'm going to vote for Clinton. One kind of experience, one case is Fatah-Hamas elections back in 2006, and I was following this very closely. All the polls said Fatah will win these elections in comfortable kind of way. The highest poll, I think, gave Hamas 30%. And then in my humble analysis, again, I said, well, Hamas at least will get 45%. Because again, not every single Hamas supporter would say, well, I am, if you go and ask them polling and things, they wouldn't say this. Now, this percentage is reduced, of course, in other settings. In America, of course, people would say whatever they think of. But still, however, you have this kind of percentage. And I think this, at the end of the day, this percentage was somehow decisive in the case of Trump.
Very good, yeah. Yeah, I've always thought that someone should have written an article about Hillary Clinton entitled, if you understand American slang, Hillary Clinton the Man, right? Because Hillary Clinton was the establishment candidate, even though she was a woman. And isn't it ironic that the anti-establishment candidate we have in 2016 is a billionaire whose father was a millionaire? I mean, it's really kind of mind-boggling. But getting back to the things that you said, Josh, which I think are very, very right on with regard to Donald Trump and explaining the Trump phenomena. You said something I think it was very interesting. You said that for Trump, politics is rhetoric and governance is policy, which is very good. My question then is, what will be the lasting consequences of the rhetoric, right? The racist rhetoric, the bigoted rhetoric, the sexist rhetoric, and so on, the anti-immigrant rhetoric on American society in the next 4 years, right? This is a concern I think that many of us have, What will be the consequences of this for, those of us who are not white and who have a college education, I guess, if that's not Donald Trump. I don't mean to be dismissive.
Yeah, and I think it's a mistake to conclude that the only people who vote for him are whites, non-college educated. So let's just use, for example, the tape of him speaking in very ugly ways about women. The media had a conniption about this, and I don't remember who it was who said, "This is over." It was on NBC. I don't remember. Some of you might remember the commentator. And what was so remarkable was how Trump simply dismissed it. And nobody in his campaign thought that this was a problem. Now, I've written about this in a First Things article recently. I said one of the most interesting things that's happening in American culture today is that there are profound religious elements that are at work that most people don't see. And because I study this, I see it a bit. So one of the great tropes in America goes right back to the Puritans. It's purity and stain. Okay? And I think identity politics plays on this purity and stain. Donald Trump is not that kind of guy. So he grew up in New York in the 1950s, and there was some of you know this, you're as old as me, and so you might remember some of this. There was a very famous Presbyterian minister named Norman Vincent Peale who wrote a book called, anybody know it? The Power of Positive Thinking.
Right.
Oh.
Right.
If you want to understand Trump, go read the book. Because instead of purity and stain, which are old Presbyterian Puritan categories, for him it's winners and losers. And so you say something bad to somebody and you just say, okay, I'm sorry, right? It doesn't represent fault to him. It's just something you said, maybe you needed to say it, you probably didn't mean it, right? And America is so Puritan that they hold things against people if they say impure things. This is what you have to understand about what was happening in the media, is that Trump doesn't care about purity and stain. This is why the media hated him. Fault for that group is for him a mistake, an error, locker room talk. You have to get this about this guy. Now, how does this, let me push this onward to foreign policy for 1 second. In terms of domestic policy, my view is he does want everybody to be a winner. As long as you're playing by the game, I don't think he cares what your religion is or your sexuality, which nobody's talked about. Peter Thiel is one of the major supporters of Donald Trump. So the gay community is behind him. But where this purity and stain and winners and losers thing is going to play out is going to be in foreign policy. Because purity and stain, understood in terms of foreign policy, plays out in the following way. Does this country have a democracy? And if so, it's pure. And if this country doesn't have a democracy, it's impure. And so Hillary Clinton looks at Gaddafi and says, well, they don't have a democracy, he can be deposed. She looks at Mubarak and says, well, impure, deposed. And I think Trump is going to have an entirely different foreign policy because he thinks like Norman Vincent Peale. It's not purity and stain. It's not the criteria of democracy as the necessary precondition for support of a government. Both the neocons and the neoliberals, both the George Bush people and the Hillary Clinton are thinking that way. And Donald Trump is not thinking that way. He's thinking, I will cut a deal with you if we can work with you. And with respect to Israel, you should remember, he went to Israel and said, if we can work together, I'll work with you. Tell me a president who said that. Okay? It's an entirely different way of thinking about the world. And so my advice to all of us is to frankly dismiss 90% of what he said. He did it to get elected. Politics is rhetoric. And the proof of this for me is Pence. And again, I don't want to say everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be a catastrophe no matter what. Okay? This is my view of this. But think about his vice presidential candidate. Okay? Mike Pence knows how the system works. And his executive style is to be flamboyant and declare all sorts of things, but he wants to make things work. And so he'll find people who execute, not ideologues. Now, the bad news, and we were talking about this beforehand, is that he doesn't have a deep bench of people who can step up into very important positions. This is a huge problem. But I think his criteria is not going to be purity and stain, and this is going to be very important for American presence abroad. It will be winners and losers, strict national interest, and I frankly think it's long overdue.
So, Khaled, you brought up the question of, and this is a good time, I think, to switch to foreign policy, the question of Iran. And maybe we can add on to that, of course, the question of ISIS and Syria and the Assad regime. And Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, not president yet, President-elect Trump, has said a number of things about the Iran deal. So he said, for example, quote, it was, quote, one of the worst deals ever made by any country in history. And so my question to you is, how will a Trump presidency not only impact the Iran deal, right? Will he really try to tear it up, or is it just rhetoric, and so on? And then also, since it is related, How will this impact U.S. policy with regard to Syria, ISIS, and the Assad regime?
Yeah, this is kind of for the people in the region. This is the heart of the matter nowadays. And this
Maybe
is why,
more so than Palestine, Israel.
of course, of course. And now, this is why when I tried kind of to think, how could I maybe predict maybe the political behavior of Trump, then judging on this very maybe ironic, friendly, love-making Putin, Trump, which is in my view very short. The idea that Trump has said maybe frequently, he said, well, when it comes to Syria, ISIS, and Russia, I am happy leaving them there, slaughtering each other. So the idea is for him just to stay away, outsourcing this killing, saying, well, Syria, Russia, they can go and do whatever they like, and I am just watching from afar. Now, this could happen, of course, only the agreement is only maybe in Syria. Now, if Russia, of course, Russia would capitalize on this. This is not kind of a short-term mission for the Russian strategic thinking. They just want even a very solid base in the Middle East. And again, as we kind of observing this American withdrawal, pulling out from the region, creating a vacuum, and then the Russians are coming in, filling in this vacuum. It is very hard to think of the Russians saying, well, we have mission done, and now we are kind of leaving. Of course, they need much more than this. The question is, would any American administration accept this new geopolitical landscape with Russia having the biggest share of influence at the heart of the region or not? So I have some big question mark on this. Now, this kind of relates to Iran, and then because you have this kind of triangle and you have Iran in this Iran-Russian kind of connection at this very moment. Now, if the Iranian deal is within this kind of, again, equation, competing or calibrating any policy vis-a-vis Russia, if another big giant move is taking place here and canceling the deal with Iran, you are again creating a bigger mess, in fact. What would be the Russian position vis-a-vis this? Is this something that you can do on your own because you have European partners as well? So to what extent you can, and he repeated this statement so many times in the front of the APAC and here and there, which means as if it's kind of really planted very well in his mind. So again, we are still in the eye of the storm. We can't predict or judge, but all these kind of questions for us to think of and keep in mind in the coming weeks and months.
Deals, after all, right? So, Joshua, you wanted to say something about this.
Let me just speak to the Russia question. So I have a hunch. I can't prove this, but I have a hunch that that Trump will say to the Russians, okay, you now have a sphere of influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. He will not make democracy the precondition for a bargain in Syria. And this is going to offend the humanitarians around the globe, and make no mistake about it, this is an agonizing situation in Syria, but it's simply not clear that the Americans with military force can make things any better. My sense is Assad will stay. I'll say it. I think Assad will stay. The Russians will have a footprint in the Eastern Mediterranean. The piece that I'm most worried about, that both the neoconservatives and the neoliberals were going to push, was an independent Kurdistan. Because when you think in terms of identity politics, you're going to say, here's the biggest ethnic identity in the Middle East that doesn't have a nation. We need to give them a state. And both Joe Biden has deep connections to the Kurdistan. I was there. That's where the American University of Iraq was, so I have some knowledge on the ground there. The neoconservatives were pushing for an independent Kurdistan. My view is the really good news is that Trump will say, no, we're not in the business of nation building, that a federal Iraq has to be in place. And if a federal Iraq is in place, then at least there's the prospect of a Syria and an Iran and a Turkey that's not irate about an emergent state the Kurds have. Now, this is a deeply unpopular position, but it seems to me that, here's my bet, right? That Syria and the Russians are allowed to work together, that we have an Iraq that stays together, and that is probably the necessary precondition for any kind of stability in that region. I'm not going to second guess Iran. We can't reinstitute the sanctions. That's clear. Nobody's going to buy into that. But it strikes me that if you can get the Syria piece right, which is to say don't use democracy as the necessary precondition for peace, and if you can keep together a federal Iraq, you've gone a long way toward helping the area. And I think that's what he will do.
So just one thing, because when we talk about Trump and Russia, it is not only Syria. You have the whole world, of course. You have a whole set of issues. Contentious, of course, and you have competition rivalry here and there. You have Ukraine, you have all these projects of gas pipelines, across Central Asia and Europe. You have the missile defense shield. Again, these are the big issues. It is not Syria. Syria, he is happy to agree with Russia on Syria. Right. And he is happy to say, well, sort it out, and then let's kind of move on. But when it comes to the big issues, right, that is where he needs to do something concrete. Well, the other kind of regional thing, in half a minute, to do with the Iranian deal, the nuclear deal, if he decides to maybe approach or even contemplate dismantling this deal, this could create some sort of temptation for certain Arab countries to push him down that road. And in this case, we will have even more volatile atmosphere, because for the Iranians, this means, these Arab countries, they will deserve to be maybe even bombed by Iran and have all these kind of conflicts and sabotage from within. So you could create, by this kind of even thinking, create a space for, again, the Gulf countries maybe to say, well, we are on your side in this. If it did happen, this means, again, more tension. If it didn't happen, again, yet you will be portrayed as if you are aligning yourself with the American Satan again against Iran. So more tensions in the region.
Well, just kind of building on this, you could kind of, in a very simplistic way, say that we have a president-elect who is a sort of neo-isolationist, right? Both in terms of economic policy and also in terms of foreign policy, at the same time that we have a Russia that is far from isolationist. And so that has consequences for the region, but you only need to think of the Baltic states, right, and the fears there. Also, if we think about Southeast Asia and some of the things that he said about Southeast Asia, right? Mr. Trump is against free riders, those who aren't willing to pay for their own defense. And I think he mentioned in the same sentence South Korea and Japan, right? And in fact, in the same sentence, he mentioned nuclear weapons or the development of nuclear weapons for those states, that wouldn't be such a bad idea, right? Against the whole idea of non-proliferation. So is it going to be the case? How isolationist, realistically, can you be as the superpower, in the beginning of the 21st century, I guess?
Yeah, I'm worried about false antinomies. So the opposite of globally involved is not necessarily isolationist, just as the opposite of free trade is not protectionist. Quickly on the free trade thing, my view is that free trade is the new protectionism. Why? Because with these various treaties, this is Trump's position, with these various treaties, you set the barriers so high, barriers to entry so high for corporations that the little guys can't get in. And so-called free trade treaties are the ones that allow the great big global corporations, because they have compliance staff, to succeed and the lesser operations can't. So we really have to think about this in new ways. Now, with respect to isolationism, which is your point, I don't think Trump is an isolationist. I think his view is that we have been unreal about the kind of world in which we live. So under the Obama administration, the term that was used, that was deliberately avoided, was allies, and the term that is used is partners. Now, this is a very interesting development, because partners can come and go. Allies you have when you have a permanent threat of war, and so you hold on to your allies. And we had this dreamy idea that we live in a post-war world, and that if Obama just goes on the apology tour, everything is going to be okay. No, we actually live in a world of war. There will never be a post-war period. I hate to break it to you, but there will never be a post-war period. And what this means is that we have to have strong allies. So on the question of Ukraine, which I'm glad you raised, and Europe, look, I have friends in Europe, you do too. Ask them seriously, if Russia were to move west, where would they draw the line? Seriously, where would they draw the line? And my European friends can't give me an answer to that. Well, would you stop at Ukraine? No, that's not going to happen. Would you stop at Poland? It's not even clear that my European friends are going to say they're going to stop in Poland. Trump is right to say to NATO, we are allies. But if we're allies and we're concerned about a world of war, you have to pay. You can't have it both ways. I think that's right. So I want a kind of realism about the world in which we live, and that means a world of war, of allies and partners. And if you're an ally, you have to pay up, or else you're not part of the alliance. I think he's right on that. That's not a protectionist position. That is a position of strength which seeks to establish who is on your side and who is not. And in a world of war, you have to establish that. So I don't know what the Europeans will do. Will they go all the way to Ukraine? I don't think they will. Does that mean, therefore, the United States should make up the difference and send troops to Ukraine? No. So we have to be very realistic about the world of power and alliances. And I don't think Trump is going to withdraw. I think Trump is seeking to establish who are our allies and who will pay to make this happen. And I think that's what you must do in a world of states where you still have the prospect of war.
And so if we can take this idea to our region here quite specifically, and to Khalid, he said, for example, with regard to Saudi Arabia, he said, quote, the primary reason we're in Saudi Arabia, I don't know what that means, we're in Saudi Arabia, is because we need the oil. Now we don't need, we need the oil. Now we don't need the oil so much, however, he goes on, right? Now we don't need the oil so much. So what do you think a Trump presidency will mean for U.S. Gulf relations, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and so on, where there is, of course, a military presence, tremendous trade, American educational institutions, and so on?
Well, the plain answer is I really don't know.
Okay.
Because simply the things that you gather throughout, the campaign and the foreign policy issues were the least discussed. So this huge, massive campaign was reduced to, Clinton's email exposure and Trump's women groping. So all these big issues were kind of thrown out of the window. So anyway, so from the kind of scattered things from here and there, you end up with a picture full of contradictions. So you see things and you think this is a line of policy. Then at the end of the day, you find the other kind of view. And I think Trump would have loved so much to hear our esteemed colleague Joshua just kind of framing these ideas in this fantastic way, because I think they're not really very clear in his mind. I don't know. But take one example, the whole idea of Iran, because it relates to the Gulf countries. He says, we are not going to allow Iran to make chaos in the region and then to play all these kind of games with Hezbollah and this and that. This, of course, lands as a music on the ears of Gulf countries. Then at the same time, he says this is a statement against Saudi Arabia. So if you want to, let's say, to stop Iran from regional expansion, this is very good news for the Saudis and others. And at the same time, you say you don't care about them. So where does it really lie, your policy? So these kind of different statements. If you take the statement for step 2, 3, 4, you are led to certain kind of conclusions. However, if you do this, logical analysis, you will kind of stumble with another line of policy that says different things. So this is why I think we are still in this kind of limbo, if you like, when it comes to understanding his real foreign policy. And as rightly said by Joshua, I think you have to take away much of his rhetoric during the election campaign, maybe 90%, as you said, which is, again, realpolitik at the end of the day. It speaks up. You have certain kind of constraints and dictates that is the reality would compel you to do, away from what you have said during this is kind of common sense, I guess, so there is no need for digression.
Sure. Let me add one more thing about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Look, be very clear on this one. Trump is going to push back on EPA, push back on climate, problems with that, to be sure. But let me be clear why he's going to do that. Because his view is that part of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. foreign policy interest would be to have prices of oil be quite low, both for domestic consumption and so that, I'll forget the Gulf here for a moment, but so that Russia is slightly weakened, Venezuela is slightly weakened. So he wants low oil prices. And that's what is going to happen in the United States. There's going to be, I hate to sound like Sarah Palin, but the whole sort of drill baby drill thing, I mean, that's too strong. But oil prices are going to go down under him because there will be a pipeline. And that is going to have all sorts of implications for domestic and foreign spending for all these nations abroad that rely on oil for revenue.
Great. Okay, well, at this point, why don't we open up the floor for discussion from the audience? And if you could raise your hand, I will choose you at random, and hopefully it'll be kind of an equal representation. And then if you can briefly address your question succinctly, that would be appreciated. Yes.
To Professor Mitchell's point about city versus rural America, this morning I was struck by the outcome of Ohio, where Columbus and Cleveland went to Hillary Clinton, but Rust Belt America, right, the Trump Democrat, the so-called Trump Democrat, gave him the state. These are people who feel disenfranchised and left behind by the economic recovery in America. So my question is, did the American public vote with their wallet in 2016?
Well, I was watching CNN this morning, so I will not claim this as my own, but the CNN commentators had properly pointed out that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had decided 20 years ago, where they both agreed with NAFTA, or both bought into NAFTA, that there would be collateral damage. And the collateral damage would be vast swaths of America. That was the deal that both the Democrats and the Republicans cut. And that vast swath of America said, no, not going to happen. So with their wallets, but look, when you don't have money, when you don't have jobs, your families fall apart, your local communities fall apart. They want that back. And let me be clear, this protectionism versus free trade is a complete red herring. And here the so-called economic conservatives on the right, who've been a friend of free trade, they have completely missed this. I teach Adam Smith. I know what he wrote. When he set out the parameters for global expansion and said it's extensiveness of markets and division of labor. Look, what was the title of his book? Ahmed was one of my first students. What was the title of his book? The Wealth of Nations. It was not the wealth of the world. So here's the founder of neoclassical economics, and he knows that you have to be concerned with your nation. And the so-called free traders are not concerned with their nation. They're just saying there'll be redistributions and we'll have job training programs. And no, your responsibility as a statesman or stateswoman is for the good of your nation. And you have to adjust trade policy with the full understanding that, yes, it might be more efficient to have all the automobiles produced in North Korea, but you still have to have an industrial base in case you have to go to war. So the real statesman or stateswoman has to make all of these trade-offs. There have been no trade-offs. Both the neoliberals and the free market conservatives had worked on the basis of pure principle. And when you do that, the people in the heartlands of these nations lose. And that, to me, is tremendously important. That is why I think we've had this election. And I see this, frankly, as a very good thing. Because, as I said before, globalization is over, people. I hate to say it. We want to say, no, global. No, it was a 20-year experiment. And it is over. And the only question now is whether we're going to have liberal states or illiberal states. So my view is the new challenge, and I'm working with some of the Republicans on this. The old Republican Party, it is over. Okay? The whole group of us are getting together, and I hope this happens on the Democratic side too. We're saying, enough of that. We need to figure out how to help the middle class and the poor in America and the African American community. Believe it or not, Republicans are starting to talk that way because it's about the nation. And that's why the heartlands in Ohio and every other place, and Michigan, the whole Rust Belt strategy that none of the elites saw, that Trump knew would win. And it was galvanizing the Reagan Democrats again, the working people of America. And it's a good thing.
Thank you. Okay, maybe, yes, this young lady here. You had your hand up a moment ago. Yes.
Hello. My question is about Trump and his plan to fight ISIS, he didn't have a clear strategy on how he's going to fight ISIS except for targeting their oil and bombarding them. I was wondering if one of the speakers could elaborate a little bit on how Trump's rhetoric basically is playing into the hands of ISIS and other terrorist groups. As you may have seen lately, Al-Qaeda had a video quoting Donald Trump saying that banning all Muslims, it's a good tool to recruit more Muslims into jihadists and other terrorists. So I'm wondering how Trump's rhetoric is going to play into the hands of ISIS, if you can elaborate on that. Thanks.
In my view, I think it plays really greatly and significantly because, and I tried kind of in the very maybe ambitious list of points that I've tried to touch upon to allude to these frustrations coming from outside the region. That is, for a long period of time, maybe 70 years or so, you have with the very heavy penetration of the region. So the most important decisions, if you like, on the future of the region, on the future even of the countries and its wealth, were somehow controlled outside the region. Unfortunately, this is the de facto. Now, part of this, when it comes to the issue of Palestine, to the issue of even oil prices, all these kind of big, hardcore issues are decided outside of the region. Now, the opposition from within, including the Islamist radical parties, and then the extremists of the extremists nowadays, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others, they are pointing their finger to this, saying, look at this. This is what has been happening in the region for a long period of time. Now, in the middle, you have, of course, the governments, the regimes. They are exposed in their legitimacy. They can't do anything. So they are exposing the internal legitimacy of these governments. And somehow you ended up with this political desertification in the region. There is no legitimacy that could do the business for its own people. And we end up with ISIS and the external powers. And of course, all these kind of racist discourse that I have mentioned, and then moving all the what you have in the darkness of the margin, whatever you have, as the mainstream discourse, of course, now is pointed at by ISIS and others, in fact, in the region, saying, look at the Americans. The Americans are saying so and so. These are the liberal Democrats that you keep kind of referring to. So the only way to deal with them is by, I don't know, force or violence or this and that. So in fact, you have these two discourses somehow are leveled up and they are feeding into each other, leaving all the moderate on all camps kind of just in their talking shops. We don't do anything. We just lecture in classes and promote, nice ideas, but nobody listens because the real power comes in the hands of the radicals on this side, nowadays exemplified by Trumpism, and then on the other side with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other extreme groups. So I think you have this kind of dynamics. And then Trump points to ISIS. This is the root of all evils. And then you have, of course, it is an evil, of course. I'm not apologetic of neither of them. But at the same time, the exaggeration of the phenomena is just amazing. Somebody sent on the other day to me this kind of statistics in the States saying, the casualties of terrorism, or the annual casualties of terrorism in the United States, every year, Islamist terrorism. You can kind of have them a handful, 3, 4, 5. Then the casualties of domestic violence, or somebody kills his wife or whatever, you have thousands of it, hundreds at least. But the focus on this is just amazing, out of any proportion. So this is again part of the rhetoric. And then ISIS again, or the other extreme groups, they would use the same rhetoric, saying, well, all evils are coming from abroad, not kind of looking in what's happening from within or the self-done mistakes, or I don't know, maybe I digressed, but I think in the nutshell, yes, you have these kind of interaction between these two discourses.
You wanted to say something?
If I may, just for a minute, I'm terribly worried about the growth of the security state in the United States predicated on the very issues you're talking about. I'm terribly concerned about this. And I do get nervous when Trump says, in his usual bombastic way, that we're going to go in and we're going to crush ISIS. So I don't think he really knows what to do. I'm really hoping, and I'm actually pushing people who are in contact with him to get somebody who understands that Iraq has really got to stay together, because if Iraq falls apart, then we're in real trouble. That's the first thing. But on the matter of the military, here's what I think Trump will do. Just a general statement about the military. A whole group of Americans look at the use of military power in the last 20 years. And on the one hand, yes, you have shock and awe, but largely it's policing power, conflict resolution. And I think my view of this is that Trump is going to pull back from all that, because that's part of state building, that's part of conflict resolution. And I think his view is we can't solve the problems around the globe. We have no business being there. So if we use military force, it is for the purpose of destruction and taking out an enemy, period. But then you don't put on the policing helmets and send them off on conflict resolution missions. This is a terrible idea. So I think Trump will use the military for military purposes, and if it's not for military purposes, I think he will pull back. Now, I think that's a good thing. Not that I want us to use our military ever, but if we have to use it, I want it to be used in the right way. The military is growing hugely. We can't afford that kind of military spending around the globe, which is more than military. It's policing power and conflict resolution. We can't do that, and we shouldn't be doing that, because it's not our business to tell the peoples around the globe how to organize their states.
Well, just on this, if I can just intervene for a second. So does Trump, and it seems to be the case that it is the case, that Trump has a fundamentally different understanding or definition of what national security is, right? I mean, and this is really kind of, a game changer for people who focus on national security. I mean, the last 30 years or so, the United States has been, in some senses, an empire of military bases to secure our national security interests overseas in South Asia and in the Middle East and so on. Trump seems to have a very different, a much more traditional early conception of national security. Is that the case? And what will be the consequences for the bases that never, that the sun never sets on or never, falls on, whatever it might be, yeah.
So here's a little something that's happening in the military, and it's very interesting in my view, is it's really important. So there's been a huge debate in the Pentagon about whether American military power should be sea power, which is its historic strength, or land power. And there's two strategies, McCann and Mackinder. And in the last little while, last 20 or 30 years, it's been the land war people who have had the highest voice in the Pentagon. And a little inside secret, what's happening is there's a huge battle in the Pentagon right now about whether that strategy continues, or whether, in fact, the older understanding, which is what you're talking about, of empire, and this is the one I agree with, and let me explain it. The older understanding of empire takes hold. What is the older understanding of empire? It's the Navy, and it is keeping the sea lanes open for global commerce. That, I think, is the good use of our military. I think the sea lanes should be kept open. I do not think that the land war strategy, which has gotten us bogged down in the Middle East, is a good way to go. So if we're going to have a military, we're going to have to make this decision about whether it's largely a land operation or a sea operation. I think it's better that we try to keep the sea lanes open, and that's the burden of empire. That's as far as I want it to go. The sea lanes open for trade, but no land wars far away.
Okay, yes, the gentleman here. The microphone is coming, I think. The microphone is coming.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on your thoughts on the idea of Donald withdrawing from policing and security.
From
Policing activity, only for military. Isn't it true historically that the United States has been leading the Western world and the Western alliance on the basis that you worry about your economies, we worry about armament and advancement in technology. We relieve you from the burdens of spending. On the other hand, you owe us allegiance as your leader in the Western world to protect you. What you are implying here is that America is no more going to play this role, i.e. countries like Japan, Germany, and France, and all the allies who could feel that they need to carry out security, that this is the time for them to go ahead on their own, on their armaments, on developing their own independence, because in many ways the United States is pulling away from its historic commitments towards them and opening the world for the rise of new military superpowers. What do you think of that?
It's a wonderful formulation of the problem, and I don't think there are easy answers. I don't wish to suggest, and I like the way you formulate it, I don't wish to suggest that America should go all the way. I think this would be a very bad idea. However, one of the consequences of the bargain that you have described very well is that Europe thinks that it lives in a post-war world. Our Canadian neighbors to the north look down at us and they say, well, why are you so militaristic? Well, the answer is in part because you guys don't have to, because we've protected your northern tier from Russia. So we've built a world, we've enabled the world, the nations who are our allies, to think that they don't have any responsibilities. I don't wish to push it back all the way and have a remilitarized Japan and a remilitarized Germany, but I do think that NATO has an obligation to meet us part way. And reasonable people can disagree about where that part way is, but it is deeply dysfunctional now. And so I think we need to pull it back a little bit. Look, let me be clear. I don't want to go back to pure nationalism, but I think the globalist experiment and the experiment of American empire in the exact way that you described, I think it's gone on too far. We can't afford it. We are $19 trillion in debt. And my view is a really very simple one. Let us sit down, if you give me one more minute, let us sit down and attend to the metastasis that has consumed our society for 50 years. What is that metastasis? In the 1960s, we had the social programs of the Great Society program, and we had the pushback against communism. We could not sustain both those programs simultaneously. We have done it on debt for the last 50 years, and so you have an entrenched democratic institutions, which is committed to programs it cannot afford. We have an entrenched military contingency, which is committed to programs it cannot afford. We have got to have a day of reckoning, and my view is we decide what we're going to spend based on what we bring in, and we start buying down our debt. We might want to do all sorts of other things, but we literally cannot afford it. This 50-year metastasis has got to stop.
Day of reckoning seems to have arrived. Yes, the gentleman here.
Hi, good evening.
It's working, yes. Yes, it's working.
Let us ask first, is America still the greatest or only a superpower? I think now, if we look to America after Trump is coming, America has debt, 18 trillion, ethnic and economic political problems. And we meet, the minorities, I don't like to say too much. I am Middle Eastern. I am concerned with America and American elections more than an American. What I say, America will change her policy. For me, either Democrats or Republicans are the same in dealing with us all the time. Now, America, in the era of Obama, is making 4 dangerous things. Totally biased to Israel, guarantee the security of Israel and not our security. Second, encouraging foundation of Shia crescent against the Sunni groups. Third, this is my opinion, please, you hear me, okay? Third, foundation of a Kurdish state in Erbil. Fourth and last, supporting totalitarian regimes in our countries like Sisi, like Bashar, like others.
Great.
So I'll say, will America change, or will she prefer her interests against her principle?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe you'd like
Would you like to take more questions?
Sure,
in the interest of
sure. We
time?
can add the questions together. Yes. The gentleman here with the hand raised, and then we'll come to you. Yes. Of course, if they have
Thank
their
you.
hand, we have one here.
Ranjal Aldin, I'm a visiting
Okay.
fellow here at Brookings Doha Center. I was wondering if the panel could perhaps shift the focus onto Hillary and discuss what
Right.
she did wrong incorrectly rather than what Trump did effectively, bearing in mind this is a man who had a celebrity status and therefore a remarkable platform, a man who was up against a two-term administration that at times it looked like it had run out of things to say and got the messaging wrong. Thank you.
Great. So, okay, maybe one last question, if we could just remember the questions. I'd promised you here in the front row. Yes, the lady in the front row.
My question is about education. What do you think of Trump's stance on education? For example, the federal policy towards it. And this morning on the news, I heard a young woman who was deeply concerned about things like student loans and the policy that he would take towards education, the financing of education. Where do you see things going under his leadership in that area?
Great. So those are three questions. If we could maybe try to kind of briefly address or touch upon three of them. I have something to say myself about Hillary, but I'll wait. Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly on the first one, I think the question reflects some sort of really deep kind of sentiment across the region. That is, the American, even / Russian combined policies nowadays, they just kind of affect the vast majority. The vast majority in the sense that is uniquely maybe in the region nowadays, maybe globally as well. You have the majority, they have this feeling of insecurity. The Sunni majority in the region, they feel under threat. Normally maybe you have the minority having this kind of feeling, but the general perception is the following. The Russians are coming and then they just hit, the Sunnis, even if it was ISIS. The Americans are joining forces with them. Everybody is on the side of either Syria militarily or Iran politically, referring to the nuclear deal. Whereas the vast majority, the Sunnis, they're kind of left exposed for nothing. Even after the erosion of political, as I said, political legitimacy of their own governments. So there is a sense of alienation, sense of marginalization, which is again very, very surprising, maybe very ironic, that though it does happen, it is there within the Sunni majority. So the comment there somehow reflects this kind of concern, that is everybody is against us. And whatever kind of policies coming from abroad is somehow affecting the Sunni majority. You have this kind of Shia crescent. You have this kind of involvement in X or Y country. The end result is this, is the further fragmentation of the Sunni majority or the Sunni kind of bloc. I have no answer to this, but again, this is part of the frustration of maybe the ill-devised or ill-designed kind of policies, be them, I don't know, Western or Russian. Thank you.
Maybe if I could just say something for a second about the question of Hillary Clinton, and I think it's a very good and a corrective to a discussion about why President-elect Trump became president-elect, as it were, and I'd be very curious to hear what both of you have to say about this. I mean, it seems to me that Hillary was an incredibly unappealing, unattractive candidate for millions and millions of those who voted for her, including myself even, right? I mean, she epitomizes the establishment. As I said, one should have written an article entitled Hillary Clinton the Man, right? She has been in power for decades. In fact, I think I read that she hasn't driven a car for 35 years. I don't know if that's correct or not, but if you do the math, it might actually work, right? So incredibly privileged, an insider. This was an election against Washington. Both the Bernie Sanders supporters, I was one of them, as well as those who supported Trump, have a problem with the system and Washington. And in fact, she enriched herself as a result of both her husband's public service and then her own public service, not to mention the ethically problematic, to say the least, kind of repetitive behaviors with regard to emails and other kinds of things. So the question then is, if the Democratic Party would have nominated almost anyone who was acceptable, and maybe particularly Bernie Sanders, things could have been different. And I think we also see that in terms of the level of enthusiasm for each of the candidates. I mean, in the first Obama election, there were many of us, me included, who were willing to write a check and willing to donate a day or two of our time to actually mobilize voters for Mr. Obama. I was barely willing to vote for Hillary Clinton with, if you understand, with a lemon over my head, and so on. And so does that, to some extent, have to do with understanding the outcome? Anyway.
Let me take the three questions that are on the table: the Sunni Shia, the Hillary Clinton, and the education. So I was here in 2005, and it was a great contempt for the neoconservatives who had just gone into Iraq a few years ago. And this is just an observation, my friends. It's very interesting for me to hear echoes of please bring back the neoconservatives, please bring back the neoliberals who support the Sunni cause. My own view is that the Americans, first of all, they don't even know the difference between the two. This is part of the problem. But my view is we need to pull back and in terms of military footprint. And I don't know where that's going to go. I don't know if he's going to follow through, Trump, on Iran or not. Secondly, Hillary. So we can talk about our affect toward her, our affect toward Trump and against, we can do that. But it strikes me that there's a bigger issue here. I'll put this in the most Marxist terms I possibly can. Hillary Clinton is on the wrong side of history. And what I mean by that is globalization and identity politics has been this experiment for the last 20 years, since 1989. And for global capitalism to work, or globalism and identity politics work, you have to have crony capitalism. And above all, and here I chide all of my colleagues at Georgetown University and elsewhere, the magic word has been global management. And this is Davos man. And that is what Trump is contemptuous of and what most Americans are contemptuous of. We are witnessing the end of Davos man. That's why the elites around the globe are flipping out about Brexit, about the emergence of nationalist movements in France and in the Netherlands. They're flipping out about it. As I said, I'm worried about these things too because absent a liberal language, you're going to have an illiberal language. So one last thing. Sure. So I think she's simply on the wrong side of history. The Clinton Foundation is ground zero for the deep rot. Next, education policy.
Can I just say something about the wrong side of history thing? And I'll let you go on. But couldn't one say that Mr. Trump and his supporters are on the wrong side of history, right? I mean, they are, from the demographics, aging white men who are declining economically and feel threatened in a society that is changing in terms of color and sexual preference and every other thing you can imagine. And so they did very well this time. But, 4 years down the road, 8 years down the road, it might be a very different election.
Yeah, and so my answer to this is that's why you guys lost. And what I mean by that is the only way you can look at the world is in terms of racial and ethnic and identity politics. And I'm saying that's what's being repudiated at this very moment. That's why I want a liberal regime, not an illiberal regime. An illiberal regime is the one that looks at your race and your identity and says this is who you are. And that's what's going to happen around the globe if you don't have a liberal regime which says you're a citizen first. And the more and more the left doubles down on identity politics, the more they will die. That's why Bernie Sanders is so very important, because he said, enough of identity politics. There are structural inequalities in America. It has nothing to do with your identity. It's a class thing. And so the Democratic Party now has to reckon, and the more they keep talking about white racists, the more they're going to lose the thread, because that's over. We have to build a nation based on citizenship, whether you're black or white or whatever it happens to be. And if you don't want to do that, and now I'll say you can join the group on the right that I say should now form a book club. This is the neoconservatives who've just pulled away and want to hang on to Aristotle and talk about lofty ideas. So I say you guys who are talking about racial politics and you guys on the neoconservative right, get together and form a little book club, but the rest of us are going to build a world based on citizenship. Now to education. I think Trump's view, which is also my view, is that I want every mother and father, teacher, student, and administrator to go to bed each night fully responsible for the education of their children, wondering what's happening in the next community over there and whether they're doing a better job than me. Because unless you get everybody involved at the ground level, you are not going to have a vibrant education system. So the No Child Left Behind has polluted higher education. And I see this in my classrooms, because our students don't know how to think and they don't know how to write. Why? Because you have national standards based on test scores. This is a catastrophe. And this is, again, part of global management, efficiency. We know what kind of workforce we need. No, we don't know what kind of workforce we need. What we need is smart, intelligent, thoughtful citizens. And each individual local community has to be responsible for doing that.
Samar, can I just have
Of course.
1 minute? It's regarding kind of the interventionist or isolationist question, and whether, as Joshua said, we need the Americans to interfere or just to go away. There's all the time this kind of confusion, and everybody's confused, including myself. Now we want, the Americans, everybody in the region wanted Obama to interfere in Syria and to stop kind of to side by the revolution against Assad. He didn't. Maybe most of the people did not want George Bush to interfere in Iraq 2003, and yet he intervened. So I think you have this kind of mismatching of desires and demands. So when you want them not to interfere, they do it. When you want them to interfere, they just abstain. So I think they do interfere in the wrong time for the wrong cause, maybe. So you need this kind of maybe new calibration of things. And the intervention, maybe for some people, is still the West, the America, and maybe even Russia. There is a need for certain engagement in the region because the region is still in the state formation. And it has been crippled for 50 years during the Cold War, relying on the United States or on the Soviet Union. So in fact, all the internal power was somehow siphoned, and you just stay there, guys, and listen to our orders. So you have 50 years somehow missing, thrown out of the window. And this is why these countries still, they think they need to rely on external powers for a short period of time. This is unhealthy, yes, but this is the status quo. So I think, yes, you have this kind of involvement, but it has been happening maybe in the wrong time again, and when you need it, it is not there. So this is kind of, again, multiply maybe the frustration. One little thing,
okay,
then over to you. And part of the involvement is when you do as external power, as Western team, Europe and America and the United States, when you go and do business with Iran, with the nuclear deal, the countries in the region, this is a regional agreement. This with far more kind of lasting consequences on the region, the nuclear deal. Not a single country within the region was involved in this. So neither the Saudis or the Emiratis or the next door countries. So they got frustrated. Now you are the mastermind of the region. You have been the biggest ally of the Middle Eastern countries, the Arab countries, the Gulf countries. And when it comes to the most regional threats in the perception of these countries, you do the business kind of individually, without even caring, without factoring in their own interest or fears. So this kind of, again, another dimension of the regional frustration among these countries.
The Germans were involved, so that makes things better. Anyway.
If I may, I completely agree with my colleague. And let me, as I said earlier, America is a religious country. Let me give a religious account, okay? George Bush, Obama, okay? Now, George Bush had a certain religious view. It's known as the city on the hill view. America is going to disseminate democracy around the globe, okay? Obama has a different religious view. It's called the repentance view. It's I'm going to go, I'm going to apologize, and then I'm going to pull completely back, producing the power vacuum that you're talking about and the tremendous confusion in the region. This is because they're two different religious views that have foreign policy implications. What I'm suggesting to you is Trump, Vincent Peale, the power of positive thinking, he doesn't even think that way. And I think this is better for the Middle East because it's strictly going to be national interest. That's different than these oscillating religious positions which either thrust American power in or completely withdraw.
Just on this point, and we'll take one last set of questions. How much of Obama's foreign policy was based on this, and how much of it was based on in his philosophy towards international affairs and America's place in the world, based on the Atlantic article and others, on simply being the person who came in after President Bush and who left 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan and wars that didn't succeed and so on? Because it seems that one can't understand Obama's foreign policy unless one understands that.
I completely agree, but so I'll modify what I just said slightly. It's the same thing. So George Bush has a religious view. It's that democracy is God's plan in history. He literally said this. You remember? I cannot believe that one half of humanity isn't entitled to freedom. This is a deeply evangelical Christian view. This had the implication, this produced American expansion, American power. And I think Obama, I mean, who is Obama's great figure? I said for Trump, it's Norman Vincent Peale. Anybody know who Obama's central figure is? It's Reinhold Niebuhr, right? And Reinhold Niebuhr was the great Protestant theologian mid-century who understood that we had to use American power, but there was always a certain pathology associated with this. The great book that Reinhold Niebuhr wrote is called The Irony of American History, the abuse of American power. And this was Obama's position. Let us pull power back in because it's always corrupting. This has produced exactly the vacuum and the inability for anybody in the Middle East to see in America a coherent foreign policy. That's right. But what I'm trying to suggest is you don't want another person coming in like Hillary Clinton who also has this city on the hill mentality that George Bush had. That's why George Bush voted for her, and the neoconservatives are in their camp. They have the same religious view. You've got to see this, people. What you have with Trump is no religious view. It's a view that it's winners and losers. I said this before. And he's simply asking the question of every nation, will you work with us to be winners? And if not, then I guess you're on the other side. It's really simple. He's a simple man, okay, who says really ridiculous things, but he doesn't have a religious bone in his body. And the great irony for those of you who followed this is why all the evangelicals voted for him. They did.
Right.
They did. Right. And they did quickly because they saw in the Old Testament many instances in which the body Israel was unified by an unholy man. And yes, and Donald Trump was the unholy King David who would revive the body Israel. That's why the evangelicals voted for him. You can't understand America without understanding this Protestant religious thing. You can't, whether it's foreign policy or domestic.
Okay, we have time for one last set of questions, if they are brief and if the answers that are given are brief as well. So, any remaining questions? Yes, here.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Mitchell. You said that Trump's position in his campaign was basically to be as inflammatory as possible, and that's how he beat out the other candidates. But then how can you say that the people that voted for him were voting, anti-establishment when they picked somebody who was part of the establishment, who was a billionaire, like Dr. Shahata said, whose father was a millionaire? And so when you ask yourself why these anti-establishment people are voting for this guy, who clearly says things that are against their puritanical views, as you put it, then how does that compute? If they are both basically against each other, you can't say that he won because he was inflammatory when the inflammatory things he said were racist, and then you can't also say that it wasn't a racist campaign. So how does that work?
So maybe we'll take just two more questions quickly. Yes, gentleman here.
Yes, thank you. Wiener Staring, The Hague Institute for Global Justice. One short question. In the view of President-elect Trump, would there be any support for post-conflict stability and peace, let's say after Mosul or after Syria?
Okay. Yes. Woman with her hand up there.
Good evening. Going forward, when will we, as citizens of the world, know when Trump is, when he'll be president? I guess starting next week. I guess.
No.
So when will we know when he's, speaking to the people of America, if he's speaking in terms of rhetoric, like just inflammatory blah blah, or if he's speaking to politics, like how will we know to recognize the difference?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we'll take those questions and then we'll answer them quickly, and then we'll move on to the reception.
So quickly to this one. My sense of this is that January 20th, when you have the inauguration, that he will shift, but he'll never completely get rid of this because this is the art of the deal. So this is a whole new shtick we're going to have to get used to. On the question about race and billionaire, these are good questions. So one of the things that struck me when Trump was one of 16, was the first thing he said, really. It was before the immigration thing. He said, I will not accept lobbyist and special interest money to run my campaign. This is unbelievable, because one of the great rots in American politics is the lobbyists who buy the candidates. So I think he has this odd position that he can self-finance. So in one sense, of course, he's part of it, but that he did not accept lobbying money, I think earned him millions of votes. And then on the race thing, I got a little bit inflamed, and I'm sorry about this a few minutes ago, but let me explain why I think we've got a problem here. If after 1989, the only language that has been publicly allowed is the language of identity politics and race. So if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so what this means then is, if people have legitimate grievances, what's the language that's allowed? And this is why I get so incensed with my colleagues on the left who say it's all identity politics. And then people who are white, they speak up and they say, oh, you must be a racist. I mean, how are we going to possibly build a civilization if the only thing we're doing is looking at the other person and saying, well, you're a this and therefore I can't take you seriously? I mean, for example, if Hillary were elected, and I was opposed to, there are plenty of wonderful women who I'd love to be president, but not Hillary, because I think she's ground central for this great rot of globalism and globalism and identity politics. But so every time I say something, I would be a misogynist. You cannot run a country this way. If I was opposed to Obama, and I was on any number of issues, he went to Chicago and Harvard. I know that. I went to Chicago. I know I know these ideas and where they come from. They're not original to Obama. There's a whole generation of people who were raised in these elite institutions, and they had them. So I'm opposed to Obama. That makes me a racist? We cannot run a world this way. We have to be able to speak to ideas. And I think this is the problem here. Everybody looks at Trump and they say, or the Trump victory, and they say, oh, a bunch of racists. Well, good luck with that. We have to build a nation, and we have to move beyond this stuff.
I think many of us agree with the sentiments that you're, speaking about. But when the candidate then says things, about Mexicans or about Muslims,
but let's be clear about
then that of course touches people. It affects people quite deeply.
Okay, let me be clear. I'm a Lebanese American. Okay, so that makes me part of this. So, am I upset by this? A little bit, but I know he's from Queens. It doesn't bug me. This is just the way he is. Now, but let me be very clear, and I mentioned this to you before. The great wound in America is the legacy of slavery.
Of course.
Make no mistake about this. And so while I will say we need to form a liberal regime, I'm going to make one exception, and I'm going to say the one wound in America that must be healed, that liberalism is largely blind to, is the African American legacy of slavery. And the legacy of the masters who were the slavery. This is racism. Completely agree about this. So I'm not blind to actual historical problems. But my objection to identity politics, and this is why I believe Black Lives Matter's got it right, my objection to identity politics is when everybody has an identity, then blacks are just one identity among many. But I'm sorry, the black condition is very different from we Lebanese and we Middle Easterners who've come to America and the Hispanics. It's very different. And so my argument against identity politics is not that we shouldn't pay attention to race, but we should pay attention to the racial issue that matters, which is the African American community. And identity politics has made us blind to that, and that's why Black Lives Matter emerges. So I'm saying the left has screwed up equality. We have to have a liberal regime where we're paying attention to the great wound in America, which is slavery. That's my position on this one. And I think Trump knows this. I really do. Have you watched the YouTube videos of Diamond and Silk? These two black women who are absolutely pounding the table in favor of Donald Trump? Go look it up. Diamond and Silk. These two black women from the inner city who have been fierce defenders of Donald Trump ever since Megyn Kelly and Fox News piled on. So there is this contingent. I happen to know I'm one step away from the woman who is the major architect of Trump's outreach to the African American community. He knows this is a problem.
Well, for me, just kind of a passing comment, then maybe a concluding remark. The passing comment on Trump, if I just kind of pause for a minute, then I ask myself, who is this guy? Well, I can't kind of find any answer except he's a multi-millionaire or billionaire maybe. Then he is super ambitious to become the president of the United States. He has his ways with the media. He masterminded, the media. He has charisma. Then he went down this rhetoric kind of road where he exploited all the fears, all the raw sentiments, all these kind of hidden, maybe dark feelings within any society. Then he just made it without any experience. So these the qualifications for any person to run for the presidency in America, to be filthy, wealthy, rich, and then have very excellent, fantastic connections with the media. Then you find your way, rhetorically speaking, and then here you go, you are the president. So I think this kind of poses a huge, big questions about the whole democratic system in America. I think there is big question, what went wrong? What is fundamentally and maybe dangerously went wrong in these elections to allow a person like Trump to rise all the way high up to the presidency? Because it is not kind of parliamentarian elections where you have certain mechanism within parties, then you have vetting system and maybe the most qualified person. If I am far more qualified, this is one of the most trivial questions, of course, all the time posed in vis-a-vis the American democracy or any other democracy. If I am a very poor man, very clever, qualified, fantastically educated, this and that, then I wouldn't stand any chance because I am not wealthy. I don't have the money. I need to rely on other sources. So I think I am not offering any answers, but kind of posing real question vis-a-vis coming out of the result of these elections regarding democracy. One kind of final conclusion, if you allow me, which is to do with American foreign policy in the region in the past, the present, and maybe in the future with the new administration. I think, again, throughout the past 6 decades, this region relied heavily on the United States. The American foreign policy was heavily intervening, penetrating the region. Now, and then we ended up with so many damages. So these kind of very long-lasting damages, they need very long-lasting fixing process. You can't just leave the damage that you have done over maybe 60, 70 years and say, well, look at you, you are non-democratic countries, you are this and that. Well, part of this, not all of it, and I'm not saying kind of everything we have to say this is the evil of external powers, but big chunk of this is due to this intervention. So you can't just simply leave the region with this big mess. You can't say, well, look at ISIS, look at all these extreme groups without going back to the year 2003 when you came from abroad and invaded Iraq and destroyed the whole country, then opened the whole gate for all these hellish, maybe extremist groups. This is one consequence of many because of the American foreign policy. So you can't just do the big mess and then turn back and leave and say, well, this is your problem. We can't understand the region. This is kind of really full of big problems and religion, culture, terrorism, this and that. In fact, no, you have linkages. You have a long process of history that has produced and resulted in the status quo that you are witnessing. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I wish we could take more questions. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of interest, but we've run out of time. So on that note, I'd like to thank both Professor Joshua Mitchell and Dr. Khaled Haroub, and also thank you for your attendance. Thank you.